I have something very special for you today. I'm joined by Martin from the Grand Thrift Auto YouTube channel, where we're going to talk about a very contentious topic, and that is EV conversions of classic cars. For those of you that aren't familiar with Martin's work, he focuses on classic cars in the real world. The Grand Thrift Auto channel is about people who actually use their classic cars. Martin has an extensive collection in various states of repair that he is trying to restore, but we're not talking sort of full nuts and bolts restorations, are we?
No, it's a bit more, well, real world than that. So, yeah, I've got about, I think it's 13 at the last count, unlucky for some. Some of them work better than others. They've all got issues of some sort, and I do a lot of the work on them myself. And none of them have been EV converted at the moment.
Yet.
At this stage.
Now, the first question I have for you before we get started, Martin, is what do you think of this lovely chair that you're sat in?
They're really comfy, aren't they? I'm liking these.
So this is the Lotus XC6 from FlexiSpot.
How appropriate.
FlexiSpot very kindly supplied these two chairs for this video. This isn't a paid thing, they haven't paid me to promote them, but they did send them to me for free so that we could feature them. And it is all of the chair you want. It reclines, oh, we're a bit...
We've crashed.
Yep. It reclines, it swivels, it tilts. It is really comfortable, actually.
They're really good. I like that. Oh, yeah.
It's quite nice quality fabric and stuff as well. Got
Yeah.
some storage in the side. It's everything you want, I think,
like-
from a...
It's like it's like the Jim will fix it chair.
Oh, steady.
No, we won't go there. But
Let's not go there, shall we? But thank you so much to FlexiSpot for sponsoring this video. Let's talk about EV conversions. Now, this is a very, very controversial topic indeed. And I think it's something that people that have a passion for EVs have a very particular opinion about. You have people thinking that we absolutely must get all these polluting old cars off the road, and therefore the best way we can do that is to convert them to electric. And some of the sort of technical marvels that go on with that are to be admired. But I think on the other side, you have the classic car community who some people get very, very uptight about preservation and originality. And you have your sort of rivet counters that you know, everything needs to be absolutely perfect. And therefore they're horrified at the idea of ripping out the drivetrain and replacing it. But I don't think, I think everything these days becomes very black and white. So you either like the idea of electric classics or you absolutely hate it and it's the worst thing possible. And I think that is how some people view the world of EV in general. It's either the answer to all your problems or, you know, the worst thing, and it's the answer to none of them, and you never want to have an electric car.
yes.
The real answer's got to be somewhere in the middle, though, hasn't it?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think for, you know, to maximize the YouTube potential of this video, we should probably end up with a fight, with you hitting me with an EV club and me bashing back with a, you know, with a classic car mace or something.
Yeah.
But like you say, the reality is somewhere in the middle. So, I think for me, it depends very much on the car, because I think there's a few things going on. So first of all, there's the whole climate change, save the planet thing to consider. That is a very real consideration. My cars are not my main daily driver. My main daily driver, let's get this out there, isn't an EV either, but that's because it's a few years old and
what type of engine does it have?
it has a diesel.
Boo!
But it's a motorway car.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a motorway car and it's a tow car for towing broken classic cars around the place.
Yeah.
And a diesel was, certainly at the time I bought it, it was the only real solution for that use case. If I were buying a new car today, I would probably go a different way, and to be honest, it probably would be an EV if I were buying it on a lease the way that most people do. So let's park that. I mean, in terms of the classic cars, they're not doing those kind of mileages. So in terms of the the emissions and whether they be the particulate emissions or the CO2 emissions or whatever, classic cars aren't, generally speaking, the problem. And while it's true that if everybody said, well, I'm not the problem, then we'd never get anywhere. I do think that kind of picking on classics, even though per kilometre they're more polluting than a modern, highly efficient 3-cylinder petrol turbo, whatever. In terms of the global effect, they're not that big a deal.
No, I think I agree with that. I think I've always said we need to electrify the mundane stuff first, the day-to-day, the sales rep in his company car, the to some extent like vans at least that are used inner city.
Yeah.
We know that for long distance trunk road type stuff, there's work to be done there, and it's a little while before we're going to have complete electrification of the kind of transport that's doing hundreds and hundreds of miles a day. We know that for cars, we're actually very close to that. We have an awful lot of people, especially those in Teslas and stuff like that, that can cover huge distances. I mean, I drove an EV from John O'Groats to Land's End. Very little difficulty. It was very straightforward and actually showed that it's really possible. But it's all the other use cases first. The local runs to the shops and the commuting and all that stuff. We should electrify all that first. Someone taking their classic car out on a Saturday morning for a pool because the weather's nice, it's a drop in the ocean in the grand scheme of things. And therefore, is that really where we need to start with electrification? I don't think that it is.
No, I agree, and I think there's partly that taking a classic car out for a pool on a Sunday afternoon is to an extent that's kind of self-indulgent, and so you can kind of question the morality of that if you really want to. But actually, there's an element of it of preserving history and preserving industrial heritage, and it brings people a lot of pleasure, not just the owners of the cars, but people who see them about. Sometimes I drive around in mine, I get people waving, I park them up and people say, oh, my dad had one of those, and or alternatively, yeah, those were rubbish, weren't they? Whatever. But there is an element of sort of democratized museum about it, which I think does add value to society as a whole in the way that art and history do. Yeah. They're not productive, they're not essential, but if all we thought about was being productive and essential, the world would be quite a sad place. Yeah,
I think that's a very fair point. And I mean, I think if we're going to talk about art, we're going to have to start with that Ferrari Testarossa. Everybody's been talking about it recently. Obviously, the guys at Electric Classic Cars have done an amazing job with the conversion. You have to marvel at the engineering feat that they've done there, because it's a hugely difficult task. I think some people say, remove the engine, smack a motor in, battery underneath, done. But we all know there's a lot more to it than that. However, that has caused a real storm on social media in particular. What are your thoughts on converting something as iconic as the Testarossa?
It's so emotive, isn't it? I think, for me, as I mentioned, I think a lot depends on the car. So, I mean, just leaving I'll come back to the Testarossa in a minute, but I think for me, there's two, even in my collection, there's different kinds of cars. There's cars that are where the engine is at the heart of it. Yeah. And there are cars where the engine is, it makes it go and stop, but it's actually about something else. So, for example, I've got a Matra Rancho, which is fascinating because it was, it's a car from the 70s, and was the sort of prototype, if you like, of the original crossover SUV with off-roader looks and practicality in a huge space.
Look at the car market today. From some manufacturers, it's all you can buy.
Exactly.
And that was the start of it all. And love or hate the SUV, it's here to stay.
And the kind of the daddy of them all is historically interesting, and it's and it's really distinctive to look at. Its engine isn't its strong point. It was the Simca Poissy engine from the 1960s. It's a pushrod engine. It's not particularly efficient. It's not particularly clever. It's not particularly refined. It's really not particularly refined. and it's not the interesting bit. So, would you be ripping the heart out of the car by replacing the engine? No, I don't think you would. There's a slightly different question in that, mine is that there are 2 UK right-hand drive Ranchos left on the roads.
Yeah.
There's a couple of left-hand drive ones as well. So mine would be, the 3rd UK right-hand drive survivor. I think there's 1 or 2 off the road. But so there's an element of they're so rare that should you mess with it, that's maybe a bit more of a grey area. Yeah. But fundamentally, the engine isn't the heart of the car, and therefore I'd be fairly relaxed about it. And just the architecture of the body means there are really good places you could put batteries. Okay. But let's not get into all the technicalities. But it would be very doable, I think, as a project. And
does the engine in your Rancho work?
It does.
It does.
And I have a video on that.
Oh,
if anybody wants to see it run, I did get it to run. It's been off the road since the 90s, and I'm in the process of welding up the rust in the bodywork. But I did get it to run before I started welding. So so it does. And that's another reason not to do it, is because it does have a running engine. Yeah. They're pretty unburstable. Like I say, it's been off the road since whenever, and still it fires up and runs reasonably well. On the other hand, I've got a full Granada estate which has a blown up engine. It's probably savable if I rebuild it, but again, the architecture of it, loads of space in the front of the flat floor at the back.
Yeah,
for batteries. You could have a motor front or back, depending. All very doable.
Yeah.
So that could be an option.
And that would be infinitely cooler than an MG5. Let's be honest.
It's a fantastic thing.
If you took the running gear from an MG5 and whacked it in there, that would definitely be an improvement. You can buy an MG5 around the sort of 10, 11 grand mark now. So I think we're almost there, I think, for a drivetrain donor. I don't think he'll be long. Ooh. Once some of those ones that are being used as taxis in London and stuff start appearing on the second-hand market with 150,000 miles on the clock, you could be on something there.
That could be interesting. Well, we'll get on to the cost side, I think, in a little bit, because that is a consideration. But I think, so for both of those, I mean, nothing against the Cologne V6 that came out of the Granada, or that is in the Granada, but they're not super rare. No. It's a solid engine, but it's not, the defining characteristic. It suits that car really well because it's really smooth, but it's not as smooth as an EV. Yeah. So, I'd have a pretty clear conscience about doing that.
And of course, any of the parts of it that still work, although they might be few and far between, could be used for another one. So it's not like,
absolutely.
You converting your Granada takes all of those parts out of circulation. In fact, if anything, much like the sort of ecosystem of old cars being recycled, the parts that you remove can go on for someone that is more focused on preservation and keeping the original engine in place, well, they can use the parts and they can enjoy them in that way. People are very polarized on this subject, but it's not necessarily this sort of wanton destruction that is painted out to be, because there is a life cycle for those parts and they can go on to be used somewhere else.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree.
I think the point about the engine not being the heart of the car is quite interesting, because one of the other very notable conversions that the guys at Electric Classic Cars have done is the Land Rover Defender. Yeah. It was one of the first ones that sort of at least gained sort of mainstream publicity about. And I can't think of a better candidate for conversion. I mean, the Defender has never been known for its engine, and I might upset some Land Rover guys by saying this, but the various engine options that were available in the Defender, they don't set the world on fire, and some of them are downright unreliable. Therefore, putting in an EV drivetrain that will work every time you turn the key and will give you power on demand. There may be a little bit too much power. I don't know what your thoughts are on the ability of the Defender chassis to handle 300 horsepower or whatever you end up shoehorning in there. Yeah. Accident.
It's the equivalent of when I was a kid, somebody putting a Rover V8 in a Mini and vaulting a hedge.
Yeah.
Wasn't me, but it did happen. I think that's definitely true. I mean, the Defender's an interesting one. I once upon a time I had it wasn't a Defender, it was that. It was a Land Rover 90, so an early coil sprung one. Yeah. It had the 2.5 litre VM turbo diesel, which was not the last word in anything really. It wasn't even that indestructible because they would crack the heads, I think, and but it was a solid plodding thing. But it made your ears bleed to drive it on a motorway. You'd be looking for the first exit to find a back road. Everything about it is rattly and noisy and industrial, and it's basically a slightly smoothed over tractor. And certainly with the ones of that era, putting a 400 bhp Tesla drivetrain in it just sounds like a recipe for disaster. I'm sure the ECC guys, because I've seen their stuff, and they seem very responsible and they're proper engineers. And I don't know what they've done, but I have some faith that it was sensible. But people doing this at home may or may not be sensible, may or may not be engineers, and yeah, it's a little bit alarming. But then that's part of life, I suppose.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think you go back to the people shoehorning inappropriate engines into minis, right? It's been happening forever.
Yes.
And therefore, whilst I guess this gives you more power on demand.
Yeah.
That people are going to do silly things regardless. And
yeah.
So I guess the responsibility and safety thing, well, people need to take a bit of responsibility for their own safety.
And that's true. There's people doing remaps and all that kind of thing, or doing anything to their cars, any kind of modifying. And I think we're going down a difficult route if we outlaw all modifying. I'm not a big modifier, but I can really admire well-done modifications. We mentioned about electric classic cars. I was at the restoration show at the NEC last month or month before, and there was a car there which was a Gordon Keeble, which is, I suppose, fairly obscure. They're a sort of British-Italian coach-built specialist sports car from the, I should have looked this up, but late 60s. And a beautiful car, two-door Grand Tourer with a Chevy small block engine. But this one had been converted by Electric Classic Cars.
Yeah.
Really discreetly done. So, it had standard-looking wheels. And they might have been slightly wider, but they looked the same. And it hadn't been over restored. It was in nice order, but you could tell that it was it still had some character to it.
Yeah.
And obviously it had an electric drivetrain. And I think that's probably a better example than maybe the Testarossa, which is kind of grabs the headlines, but. The Chevy the world is full of Chevy small blocks, and that's kind of not really the point of that car.
Absolutely. I mean, in America, you're always tripping over Chevy small blocks, right? Everywhere you go, they literally are everywhere, and it's not an exaggeration, because it's the go-to engine for conversions and stuff. We talk about EV conversions, but for forever, people have been shoehorning them into things.
Exactly.
It's not new.
So you've got an elegant coach-built Grand Tourer, which is even more elegant for having an electric powertrain, I think. Okay, you don't get the V8 burble, but and maybe you'd miss that. But I mean, fundamentally, people get very romantic about the sounds of engines, but and the sound of the pistons going up and down. But actually, if you can hear the pistons going up and down, something's gone really wrong. What you can actually hear mostly is the exhaust. So I mean, you're effectively listening to the car farting really, really often, which, if you think about it that way, has quite a lot less magic to it. So, you can get overly hung up on these things. I think that Gordon Keeble with a really nicely done conversion, really discreet, preserved all the elegance of the car and probably made it a whole lot more refined to drive, even if it doesn't quite have the same soundtrack.
I think you're right, and I think that is where the real opportunity lies. We might have the big hitter stuff like the Testarossa that's done for clicks and views, but there are cases where you can actually make an impact and improve on the experience. Yeah, you might take away the noise. People get very emotional about the noise, but it's the smoothness, isn't it? And I think that can make a real big difference. And I think there are probably good opportunities to actually make improvement through conversion. It's not necessarily about removing something. You're actually adding in smoothness.
And I think that, I mean, if you take something like, so you mentioned Lotus in the context of these chairs. I've got a Lotus Elite from 1976.
Yeah.
For me, I mean, one, that's not very practical to convert because there's nowhere to put
Yeah.
you probably fit an electric motor in it.
Well,
but you'd have to tow the batteries on a trailer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing is like the motor part of the drivetrain, the replacement for the engine, if you like, is actually really compact and it will fit in most things. I've seen previously demonstrations of like, here's everything we removed and here's the tiny bit we put in, and then the battery. So finding somewhere for the battery is ultimately the hard thing.
And people convert Porsche 911s, so I'm sure it's doable.
Yeah.
But for me, the engine really is the heart of that car. It was it's a 16 valve, very efficient for its time, still pretty efficient now in terms of its specific output. That car is a lot about the engine.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't convert that because I think then you're missing the point. You're definitely throwing out the baby with the bathwater there. Whereas others, I think, would be a very, very different story.
I think that's okay though, isn't it? Nobody's saying you have to convert everything, and therefore, if you have reason to, and I think it becomes a personal choice, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There might be someone else out there that has an Elite that thinks, well, actually, I really want to EV convert it, and that's also fine.
If somebody does, I'd be fascinated to see it and how they overcame that engineering challenge.
Yeah.
And what it was like to drive afterwards and compare them. It would be really interesting. But I think it'd be a shame if I was mandated to do it. But I think that's really unlikely.
Yeah, I agree. I think the closest you might get to an EV converted Lotus is if we stick a drivetrain in one of these chairs, like Ed China's sofa. That could be quite interesting, couldn't it?
But EVs are the future of Lotus, and then they bring out some really, really interesting new generation of cars.
Yeah, absolutely.
Made in China, of course. But.
Of course, and going down the SUV route is another very controversial topic, one that we definitely don't have time to feature in this video.
Let's not go there. Which probably sort of brings us back to the Testarossa. I've probably dodged that question long enough, haven't I? I mean, I think you don't get much more integral to the essence of the car than a car that is named after the colour they've painted its engine, right?
Absolutely.
So, a Testarossa without the red-headed flat 12, is it even still a Testarossa? Well, they call it the Teslarossa, don't they? So,
yeah.
And it's red, so, and it's the running gears is a Tesla, so box ticked. So, look, I think they've done it for. It's the Mount Everest thing, isn't it? They've done it because it's there.
Yes.
They've done it as a can we do it? They've done it to get publicity, which has been fantastic at. And I imagine it's an amazing thing to drive. One of the things I think is important, though, to bear in mind before you hate on them if you're going that way, is that it is all reversible. So their philosophy is to take the engine out, use the mounting points to rig a subframe, and then all the new stuff is bolted onto a subframe. So you could just unbolt that out and bolt the engine back in.
Yeah, I think that is important. I mean, I think a lot of people think we're chopping things up and it's never going to be the same. You'll never be able to revert it, and that's not necessarily the case. And in fact, from what I gather, the DVLA have a very dim view on radical alterations like that, and we get into the realms of Q plates and IVAs and all that horrible stuff that nobody wants to get involved in, let's be honest. So making it modular and making it reversible is the name of the game if you actually want to get it registered, get it on the road, and not have to worry too much about the paperwork that goes with it. I'm sure there might be some people out there that might not worry too much about that, but obviously it's very important for insurance and stuff that things are properly registered and declared, and therefore if you want a legal EV conversion, you're going to have to be respectful of the structural integrity, and you can't just go hacking things to bits. And therefore, reversible conversions, if you'd want to, are very possible, and seems to be the name of the game from the people that are doing it properly anyway.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that is valuable from a safety point of view, from a preservation of heritage point of view, from all of those points of view. It's hard to get any more upset about somebody making a reversible modification to their car than it is to get upset about them, not emptying the ashtrays or something. Yeah. It's kind of it's up to them, really. I think there's a lot of that. It becomes very tribal, as you said up front.
Yeah, I mean, some of the comments I've seen about the Testarossa in particular are, I mean, I think it sums up social media in general, though. People are very tribal and very extreme with it.
Yeah.
I think um, the pros and cons can be debated, but people take it a little bit too far. Um, and I think what you say about it being a little bit of a publicity stunt, I think is pretty clear. We're not going to see every remaining Testarossa in the UK suddenly be converted to electric any more than we're going to suddenly see en masse electric car conversion. I think some people have this view that eventually classic cars will be legislated off the roads, and therefore this could be one way to get around that. But I don't see that happening.
No, I don't see that happening. I think it will get harder to buy fuel.
Yes.
And in the same way as now people worry about, will I be able to find a charger free? Will it work? Will I be able to navigate the payment system? All of that stuff as that infrastructure matures and develops, we're going to see the flip side in, I don't know how many years it is, 10, where it becomes harder to find petrol stations, because there'll be a tipping point where it makes, because petrol station infrastructure, the tanks and the pumps and so on need to be ripped out and replaced every, I think, about 10 years. Somebody might correct me. 10, 15 years. There'll become a point where forecourt owners are making the decision of, do I replace my fossil fuel infrastructure, or do I install a load of chargers and become a charging stop? And quite a lot of them will decide on the latter. And then you'll have to start to think about, where am I going to go to get petrol? Because at the moment it's all very well saying, well, I'm not going to buy an EV because petrol stations are everywhere and chargers aren't. But that'll flip round at some point.
And I assume you're already seeing this with a lot of your fleet with the E10 fuel. So I imagine not very many of your cars are compatible with E10 out of the box, at least.
No, they're not. I mean, a couple of them are. So I have a Lotus, a 70s Lotus Elite, hence the chairs, which runs on, which apparently is E10 compatible. On the other hand, it seems to eat fuel pumps.
Yeah.
The engine was designed to be compatible with US legislation, and that's always had high ethanol content, I think. But yeah, and certainly finding 99 octane isn't always easy. And Esso used to do their Esso Supreme used to be ethanol free, increasingly isn't anymore. They used to say, only a couple of places in the UK did it have an ethanol in. Now it seems to be, you might find some ethanol free and you might not if you look on Esso's website, which is a shame because I used to use that quite a lot. But and it's all very well saying, well, you've just got to replace some fuel pumps and some hoses. I've got 13 of these damn things. Yeah. And okay, they don't all run, but that's a lot of fuel pumps and a lot of hoses. So and carburetors and seals and whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that'll flip round, and it will be much more of a labour of love to run a petrol car at some point in the future. Is it going to get legislated out of existence? I think that's really unlikely.
Yeah, I agree. You only need to look at ULEZ and stuff for the moment. Now, I know it's a hot topic and I don't want to go down that particular rabbit hole. But at the moment, there are very clear classic car exemptions. Yeah. So anything over 40 years old is good in I think all of the current clean air zones, obviously definitely in London, but I think in the rest of them as well, there's a classic car exemption.
I've got an idea Bristol isn't, but most of them are. That seems to be the norm.
So I personally think that these things are here to stay.
Yeah.
Because we're not suddenly going to see everyone en masse decide a 70s Lotus is the car to use to commute to work every day, even if it does mean they can get around the ULEZ. It's not practical, is it? I mean, you'll be replacing the fuel pumps at the side of the road every 2 minutes trying to get yourself to work. It's not realistic.
I have commuted from Wales to London in my Lotus. The headlights packed up on the way home in a rainstorm, and that was a bit of an adventure. But so I wouldn't do it every day. People do commute in classic cars. I mean, you see quite a lot of classic cars in central London. It's quite a good place if you want to go and spot them. But Well, yeah, we're not. I mean, there just aren't enough of them out there for people to see a mass switching because they want to avoid, the evils of EVs. It just doesn't really make sense.
And if anything, there may be the argument for an EV converted Classic would be more fit for doing higher miles. You're less likely to run into these, a well done conversion, of course. You're less likely to run into these reliability issues. Fewer things to go wrong. You don't need to worry about E10 petrol eating your fuel pipes and all that stuff. Yeah. So maybe we'll see a little bit from people. And I know you said we were going to talk about cost. People with the money to spend might choose to convert something because that would make them a better daily driver to go from Wales to London if they want to. But it's a serious amount of money, isn't it?
It is, and that's the challenge. So part of me really likes the idea of, particularly, I think the Granada is the obvious candidate because it needs a replacement or a fundamental rebuild of its engine anyway, which most of mine don't. So a Granezla would be really quite a fine thing to plough up and down the motorway in. It looks great, it's super comfortable, it drives really nicely, it would drive even more nicely with an even smoother drivetrain. The Ford V6 isn't bad. And it's very doable because it's a big car with a big flat floor and a diff at the back that could be replaced by a motor. But having looked at the cost, and it's interesting what you're saying about MG5s, but having looked at the cost for, you're talking about, I don't know, somewhere around of the order about £8,000 for a motor, and another 20 maybe for a decent battery with some good range to it. That's probably refurbed, not brand new. It might be a bit less, but depends on how much you want.
Yes, I mean, I do wonder if that cost is going to keep coming down as we see. Like I say, there is now an aging fleet of EVs. When I say aging, a lot of them are 4 or 5 years old now. But we're obviously getting to the point where many more vehicles that are suitable to be the owners are going to start appearing. It wasn't really worthwhile using Nissan Leafs and stuff like that as donor cars because of the battery chemistry, but we're seeing more and more stuff. I mean, I believe the Volkswagen battery modules used in like the ID3 and all that kind of stuff are very, very good for conversions because of how modular they are, and therefore you can build them up at the required voltage fairly easily, and they're very compatible with various different motors, so you don't need to stick with the entire Volkswagen drivetrain, but the batteries are good. I mean, I was actually looking at some of their modules for my Axim, the Axim City Electric, which is still broken, still haven't done anything with it. And realistically, ditching those old lead acid batteries and putting something modern in there would be the way to go, but it costs a lot of money. But that price is coming down. People can talk all day about how, there'll be scrap after 5 years because the batteries will be broken, but realistically, they'll be crashed, they'll be stolen, recovered, whatever means that they end up in a scrapyard early in their life. It's not because they're broken. The batteries, the motors are perfectly usable and therefore could feed the conversion market, and that means the barrier to entry should start coming down quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of my mental picture is that if somebody crashes a Tesla, then all the conversion people will descend on it like vultures and fight over the battery, fortunately there's a steady supply of crashed Teslas. No, that came out wrong, but that's how this works, right? So I think it's all. It is quite doable, and as you say, I'm just really looking forward to it becoming more viable. And there's some interesting things that people are doing, probably more in the US, but I'm sure it's happening here too, with making these conversions more modular and more kind of out of the box. Yeah,
there's a company that makes a kit for the Mini now, isn't there? Where you can.
I think I've seen that. Yeah,
bolts on. It's ready to go. I think it's quite a lot of money. Again, goes back to the cost thing, but it is more or less ready to go. I mean, we're almost talking like kit car style, assemble it in your garage on a Sunday type. But that was it for this video. I do hope you found this discussion about EV conversions of classic cars really interesting, and I also hope You look in the description for the links to Martin's channel and some of the videos that we featured here, because I do think if you've got an interest in classic cars, his channel is definitely one that you need to start watching, if only because it gives you a very unique perspective on the classic car world that I don't think you necessarily get from everyone. Absolutely must get yourself into the comments and tell us both what you think of EV conversions and the topics we've been discussing here. Are you one of those that think it's absolute sacrilege and you'd never do it? Or do you think that, like we've said, on a case-by-case basis, it is something that you would consider? We'll welcome all points of view, and it will be very, very interesting to see what kind of discussion this sparks. But that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.